Hi, Isaac.
Rabbi, good morning. It's great to see you. Happy
Great.
Shabbos.
Yeah, great to see you. Trugging along in this paralytic story. Okay, so you can get started.
The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 9, verse 6. But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He said to the paralytic, Rise, pick up your bed, and go home.
Okay,
And he,
so I mean, yeah, that's enough, probably for today. So I think we already spoke about Son of Man, so I'm not going to focus on that. But I feel like there's one word in this verse which I think is the crux of the verse, and it's that he has authority on earth to forgive sins. So let's remember that the scribes were inwardly thinking that Jesus was blaspheming by forgiving the sin or sins of the paralytic. It's unclear what his sin was. It's unclear if he even did a sin. It's unclear if maybe the fact that he is a paralytic means he had sins. Otherwise, he may not be a paralytic. There's a lot of interpretations of what this could mean. But whatever it means, it's very clear that Jesus not only believes he has authority, but the evangelist in this situation, says he has authority because it's one thing. Imagine Isaac, I say, I have authority over you. You'd be like, no, not really. But I can say what I want. But what's interesting about this case, not only does he present what we said yesterday was a fortiori argument where he was saying that which is easier to say sins are forgiven or walk. So that's one argument. If he only stopped there and said, here's my logical argument, that would not be authority. That would not be miraculous. That'd be logic. And he could have stopped there and just said, I'm presenting a logical argument. But instead, he says, I believe there's a logical argument that could be buttressed or supported by a miracle. So, if this logical argument, which could exist without the miracle, by the way, but if this logical argument is rooted or founded in the miracle, that just proves that he is right. And it's not blasphemous for him to say the sins are forgiven. So therefore, he presents this logical argument, and then he says, I'm going to show you that I am right, that I can make it that the sins are forgiven. And sins forgiven in this situation means that the paralytic will stand up and walk. And he says to them, stand up and walk. So we don't have to see the next verse where it's accomplished. But over here, the evangelist in Matthew is very concentrated and focused on the fact that why is the Son of Man able to make this logical argument that's buttressed by this miracle? Because he has authority on earth to forgive sins. So, Isaac, very simple question for you. What is Jesus' authority?
yeah, so going back to, so yesterday we spoke about how his was a fortiori argument where he says, if I can do this, then I can do that. And you also mentioned how forgiving sins is so common, but healing a paralytic is not is very rare. But here, right, so Jesus, he kind of reverses the trend. He starts with the easier one, as in I forgive sins, which as you mentioned, it's done numerous times. And then and then he sets the bar higher, as in that I can also heal this person, make him walk again. So to answer your question, right, uh, what authority does Jesus have? It's authority over both the visible world and the invisible world. The paralytic to me is the visible world, as in something physical in this world. Since, as we discussed, is more metaphysical, and we don't quite know how logic works in that sense. And so I think in this sense, he's saying that he has authority on, as in both on the physical realm and on the invisible realm, to do what he thinks is best.
It's so interesting. So I feel like you're just saying a classic model. He could do what he wants.
Yeah.
The summary. He could do physical things, he could do metaphysical things. Okay, so that's great. So in other words, he is God-like in that way, or God, however you want to say. And I think that is fine. I think when we look at the narrative, the arc of the narrative of Jesus' life, it doesn't really feel as much that he has full authority over all things, right? One could argue against after the fact that his death and the physical pain he went through was part of his authority, but usually authority is aligned with power. And if anything, the Greek word is not necessarily even authority. The Greek word is authority and or power. So I think either translation would be fine for the Greek word for this. And therefore, it's very interesting when you look at different time periods in history, what does it really mean to have authority? If I am able to control the metaphysical world, but not the physical world, or vice versa, is that authority? I think, if anything, if I said to you, independent of reading the New Testament, I said, what does it mean to have authority? You would never say what you just said. You just gave a very miraculous, magical, divine power kind of definition of what it means to have authority.
Yeah, right. But I would say that having authority is one thing, but wanting to use that is a
Oh,
different thing. So in this case, right, even though he had authority, he could have chosen to not use it, right? And in that case, it doesn't just because it wasn't used, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So I'd make a distinction.
100%.
I'd make a distinction between he having something and then deciding to use this. So when I look at the cross and the crucifixion, death, and all this, he could have chosen to kind of do what he wanted to do, but I think in that sense he chose not to. And so I think that's, well, at
Yeah,
least.
you're saying a classic definition of a leader. A leader doesn't wield his authority and his power every second. He's able to delegate through his management style to make sure his goals are accomplished. So you're saying obviously Jesus doesn't have to throw, I was saying, how come he goes through such pain? You're saying that's fine because he doesn't have to go and wield all his power at every second. That'd be lunacy. He wields his power strategically and he, makes sure dexterously uses that power in a wise way. Okay, and that's what he did here. So I want to root this idea of authority in the idea of the Christ, in the idea of Messiah. And I think the idea of having authority is a subcategory of being a messianic figure. And I think one of the things that we sometimes struggle through is trying to differentiate the first century Jewish and or Isaiah biblical kind of Messiah from the idea of being a godlike character. As you know, the idea of being a Messiah would have been very, very rooted in Jewish tradition, while the idea of being a god would have been very anathema to Jewish tradition. The
Mhm.
Jewish tradition naturally would have a strong aversion towards it. So I want to try to, at least to start, root this authority, at least in traditional first century historical cultural context of first century Jews, and see how does this line up? Does this make sense? So to start, I want to first show you a more classic idea of Jewish authority. Um, the most famous idea that we see around the Messiah is that of Maimonides. So I'm going to read from you chapter 11 of his book on kings and how he expects the things to be in the Messianic age. So he writes in the 12th century, in the future, the Messianic king will rise and renew the Davidic dynasty, one, restoring to its initial sovereignty, two, he will build the temple, three, and gather the dispersed of Israel, four, then in his days, the observance of all the statutes will return to their previous state, five, he will offer sacrifices, six, observe the sabbatical jubilee years according to all their particulars as described by the Torah, seven. Anyone who does not believe in him or does not await his company denies not only the statements of the prophets, but of the Torah of Moses. So this is a very, very famous kind of attitude that Maimonides says that the Messiah has authority to do legal things.
Mhm.
Maimonides is rooted in, I think, a bifurcated tradition. On the one hand, there's this idea in Judaism of having a magical, miraculous, divinely powered Messiah. But on the other hand, there's this very famous Amora, rabbi of the third century, named Shmuel, and he lived in Babylon. He lived in Iraq at the time, and he says that there will be no difference between the Messianic age and the age that he was living in, namely the way that the normal way of the world works, except that the Jews who are living in the land of Israel will no longer not have their sovereignty. They'll have sovereignty over themselves. They'll be in charge of themselves. So what's interesting is that we see two, I think, interesting attitudes towards authority. One, we see Maimonides say specifically that he will do a lot of things and he will have, I think, authority to be like what I would view as like to restore how the theocracy should work. And then you see Shmuel in the third century argue that the authority is nothing like that. The authority is very simple. The Jews can live their lives as they want. So I think what's interesting is that we don't really see in either of these two definitions anything remotely like what Jesus does. So if I ask you, putting aside the idea of Jesus being God, why would you think Jesus is a messianic character? And I'm happy to ask you that, or I can just answer it. But like, why would you think he's a messianic? I think it's too easy for you. You're saying he does all the other things, but in general, I think Christians will say like one of like, let's say 5 things. One thing they'll say the divine, like he's the son. In Christian belief, he's regarded as the divine son of God, and that's part of the Holy Trinity in some sense. And therefore, it will be in this situation, it'll be like a messianic character. Number two, which we've already seen in other places in we've already seen other places in the New Testament, in Matthew specifically, we see that there were certain prophecies in Zephaniah and Obadiah and Isaiah, and there is prophecy fulfillment. So Jesus is fulfilling the prophecies in order to show he's Messiah. Number three, we see that his miracles itself are supposed to be proof of his messiahship. Number four, he's supposed to be a redeemer. His sacrificial, his death on the cross is supposed to be somehow messianic. And number five, I think a Christian would say that the resurrection and ascension is a proof also. So it's interesting. I think of all 5 of those, only maybe 2 of them would be under classic Jewish definitions. Divine sonship, cross off. Fulfillment of prophecy, 100%. That is something that he's meant to do. Number 3, certain miracles. I think that's totally acceptable. Savior and Redeemer throughout, and resurrection and ascension throughout. So what we see is that Jesus is a kind of Messiah for a Jewish tradition, but he would be a very different kind of Messiah. And what I think is so interesting about this is Maimonides, again, our 13th century rabbi, our 12th and 13th century rabbi, what he says is that when you read through all the traditions and all the stories and all the biblical texts regarding what's going to happen in the Messianic era, we have thousands and thousands of teachings. You know, that the sheep will live with the wolves with a biblical level, but we also have that the righteous will live with crowns on their heads in that time. So we have so many teachings in that Messiah, and that yet Rambam says, Maimonides says, there's no real way to know which of these teachings are metaphorical and which of these teachings are literal until it happens. The rabbis took such a creative attitude towards the Messianic age, as well as the prophets took a possibly metaphoric or literal, and we as people today don't have the ability to decipher, to evaluate and assess the differences between the metaphor and the literal eventuality of a Messianic era. So Maimonides says we have to hold off. We can't look at prophecy fulfillments as a way to really figure out, because we don't know what the prophecy really is, if it's a metaphor or it's literal. And you and I struggle with this. A lot of times we'll say, okay, will the sheep really live with the wolves? Will the knowledge be so encompassing in the world in the Messianic era that it will be like the water covers the earth? When I hear that, what I hear is a literal impossibility. The world can't run that way, and hence it's a metaphor. It's an allegory. It's trying to teach us a beautiful teaching about in the future time that the advent of the Messiah, we're going to have a different kind of reality. And we have throughout Tanakh, throughout the Bible, we have what we call the day of God, the day of the Lord, which happens, I think, Isaiah 7:18 to 7:25, but it also happens in Ezekiel, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Zephaniah, Zechariah, Malachi, and happens in Acts, Corinthians 2, Thessalonians, Peter, so in Revelations, obviously. So it happens everywhere. And that idea is that God is going to kind of manifest himself in the physical world, something that Christianity has not yet experienced. I think they hope it's going to happen the second coming. Judaism does not believe that has happened. And this idea of the day of the Lord definitely happens in other religions as well. So what we have is this really interesting situation where Jesus' messiahship is rooted in Christian tradition that is not identical to what Jews in the first century would have had stated. And therefore, you would probably say this, and we'll talk about this, how this might be subversive. This might be a new neologistic kind of attitude towards what it means to be the Messiah, especially when you take into account Maimonides literally says that the Jewish people don't really know what's going to happen. We have to wait and see. Okay, so good so far?
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. They have two different definitions of Messiah, and so yes, what works in one doesn't work in the other. And we also don't know what's how much. Looking at some of these, we don't know how much of these is more it's more literal towards metaphorical.
Right. So now let's switch back. So one of the subcategories, which we said, is that the Messiah will have authority. And it's very clear for Christianity, this is such an important concept. Saying this is what the Son of Man does. The Son of Man doesn't necessarily go, I'm going to resurrect. Or he doesn't say, I'm going to fulfill prophecy. He says, I am going to have authority on earth. This is so important. So now I'm going to ask you, Isaac, what does it mean when Jesus says he has authority on earth? This is something that you tried to say at the start. You said like, oh, he just has power to do anything. But I think when you look in Christian and Jewish tradition, there are actually lots of possibilities. I think if you look at a Christian today and say, when Jesus washed the feet of the poor, was that an expression of his authority? I think every Christian will say yes.
Yes.
Say, well, but when a Jew hears that, they go, that's proof that it didn't have authority. So Isaac, why would that be showing authority?
Well, that is a mark of humility, right? I mean, and
Is
so
humility and authority the same word?
well, and so to me, what that means is having it. So this goes back to having authority but not using it. So it's
So Jesus shows his authority, but not using it. But when I said to you, like when he washed the feet, that was an expression of his authority, and you're like, of course.
yeah. So maybe I shouldn't say that's more. It's an expression of his humility, probably not an expression of his authority, but it's an expression of his humility.
Okay, so I feel like a lot of people would say it's an expression of his authority as well, but I hear that. So let's go through different opportunities, different attitudes. One could be divine authority. He just is God on earth. Whatever God can do. Another one would be spiritual authority. He has authority over the whole spiritual realm, which is one of the things that you said. But in the New Testament, that means he would have control of angels, of demons, of any kind of exorcisms, of anything like that. I think when we look at it from a like John Dominic Crossan perspective or a modern perspective, we'll say moral authority. He's able to teach a morality that was, I think, at odds with the world, and his moral authority is the authority. That is the way to work the world. What should be your attitude towards the meek? Jesus will tell you. What should be your attitude towards prayer? Jesus will tell you. What should be your attitude towards charity? Jesus will tell you. And what if you see other teachings against those teachings? You're wrong. Jesus is moral authority. And I think that is an authority that when we look at it in the 21st century, that's probably one of the most important moral authorities, especially as we go back to read the text in a non-Catholic way. I think the most, from a Catholic perspective, one of the most important authorities is the salvific authority, that Jesus has authority to forgive sins and offer salvation to humanity, which is technically two things, right? Forgive your sins, good, but then on top of that, offer salvation to everyone. And I think that authority is one of the most important attitudes, which in this verse, I think we are seeing that specific kind of authority, not only a spiritual authority, but that. And the last authority I want to point out to you, which is from the Jewish perspective, the most important one, and the one that we see throughout Maimonides, is judicial authority. So judicial authority means he's the ultimate judge, the person who can rule on halacha, on legal matters, to determine any single situation for a person, which is what we saw in that a fortiori argument in 12:11 and 12:12, namely that Jesus was saying, if the sheep should be pulled out on the Sabbath, so too a person should be pulled out on Sabbath. Well, that could be a parable, and it for sure is a parable, but on top of that is also a legal ruling. And the legal ruling would be that you have to treat people in a special kind of way in that situation. So I think when we talk about authority, again, some of those authority attitudes overlap with Jewish, namely judicial authority, namely moral authority. Jesus also viewed as a teaching authority, but the salvific authority or the divine authority would not overlap. If anything, if I had to say, where does authority come from in Judaism? We've seen, I know I quote this story a lot, which I quoted recently, the story of the oven of Achnai, which shows that the Jewish people in the time of the second century, where we have that story where three miracles occurred to show that one rabbi was right, and the other rabbis said, we don't care about miracles today. We only say that God gave us a system in the Bible, and we follow that system. So that story is meant to teach you that authority does not rest in the divine. We don't care if God intervenes today. We don't care if a voice comes down. We don't care if miracles tell us to do something else. What we care about is legalistic authority. So what we say, the Sanhedrin, let it be the minor Sanhedrin or the large Sanhedrin that sits on the Temple Mount, the rabbis understood that the Beit Din Hagadol, the Sanhedrin of 71 rabbis, would have been the legal and judicial authority at the time, tempered with the patriarchal, the patriarchate power, which we know in the first century and the second century, we mentioned Gamaliel and we mentioned the other kind, and Hillel and the other rabbis who would have had the authority to A, interact with the non-Jewish community, B, set the calendars, C, to set like the borders of Israel. And we see that those two elements, the patriarch as well as the Sanhedrin, along with, at least earlier, it would have been the Kohen Gadol 200 years earlier, the high priest, those would have been the authority elements for the Jewish people. So we see, again, just want to point out, two very, very different attitudes towards authority. It's so much so that if Jesus would have said, I am doing a miracle to show you that I have authority to forgive sins, at least according to rabbinic tradition, we wouldn't have cared. And this comes back to like the point where Jesus maybe isn't really speaking to them. And maybe he's not speaking to the scribes because his arguments, I don't think would have been potent to the scribes. The scribes, when they heard, they go, wow, that guy's blasphemous when he thinks it. And now he's blasphemous and a heretic. It wouldn't have been an argument because the way that they saw authority would have been so much different. The way that they saw the spiritual redeemer or the political and social redeemer of messiahship, even the religious expectations that Jesus is putting forth are not along the same parallel lines with the religious expectations of the day of the Lord. And I think this is one of the things that we see, that why does Jesus have to rise again? Like, why is it essential? Like, how many times does he have to rise? For a Jew, the fact that he has to rise again is a defeater for his very messiahship. Because if he's Messiah, just let him get the stuff done. It's been 2,000 years. And for a Christian to a Jew, the fact that it's taking so long is the feeder for the Jewish perspective. Saying like, I understand. If you're Messiah, like God's speaking Messiah forever, when's it going to happen? So I think that both communities cannot look eye to eye and speak face to face in a way that the idea of Messiah really overlaps. Okay, so to finish, I just want to finish on the idea of we almost never quote, I think, modern Christian commentators, theologians, but I just want to give you some backgrounds of what some of the people say today. One of the ideas that I saw when I was researching this is that it's so important. This was from N.T. Wright, and he points out that the identity of the Messiah as the Son of God is the idea of authority. That is, Jesus' authority stems from his unique relationship to God as his Father. So that idea not only would be heretical to Jews, but I think, at least in the Judeo context, would have been a very novel idea. It would have been something that would have made no sense to some people, and it would have taken time to really understand what that means. That's one perspective on authority, and I think that's the one that you would accept, even though you seem to be squinting at it.
No, yeah, I think whatever N.T. Wright says, that N.T. Wright is a wonderful theologian. He is just brilliant. Yeah, thank you.
So the next one, when I thought this is the one that you would maybe like the most, in that Elisabeth Schüssler Fiorenza, she notes that Jesus' authority comes from his social cultural perspective, namely that he's subversive. The subversive nature of Jesus himself is his authority. How does Jesus express his authority? Even in our story in 9:5 and 9:6, what is he doing? His authority, his power is expressed in helping the weak, helping the marginalized. What did he do? Did he heal Peter in 8:14, 8:15, or did he heal Peter's mother-in-law? He goes and heals the marginalized, the poor, the women, the oppressed, the groups in the first century who no one cared about.
Yeah.
And Jesus' authority was in a subversive authority. It's not about that God gave him power. The very fact of how he shows authority is itself something that challenges other authority. And that is the most important thing. He's challenging the hierarchical structure of the time. And that itself, by showing a different model of authority, it itself is creating an egalitarian world, a more inclusive world, a world that Jesus would want to be part of, and setting the foundations for a messianic era for himself. The last one I just want to point out, just because I feel like we have to present at least one somewhat heretical idea. And this one, I'll point under Marcus Borg and under John Dominic Crossan. So John Dominic Crossan, as I pointed out in the past, points out that from his eschatological perspective, the world didn't change after Jesus. Jesus maybe changed the metaphysical world, but the physical world was identical. And if anything, the miracles in the New Testament should be taken as metaphors. But Marcus Borg, I think, also presents an idea that goes along those lines, that he sees Jesus as a wisdom teacher. And his authority derives from his profound insight into the way that humanity works, the human condition, the way that God works. So he's able to almost be like a political commentator. It's just like we see today, that someone would be able to really show his sagacity by having a unique insight into the world. So too, Jesus had such a unique insight into the world that him being this wisdom teacher allows for him to not wield power, not in order to show that he's enforcing people or making sure everyone jumps along his bandwagon. He never demands obedience. If anything, Jesus runs away from obedience, but he tries to get you a deeper understanding of God that he would say is more true. God being compassionate, God being just, God having transformative love. All these things are, what does it mean, authority? It means that you have a new understanding of God. So let's just review these three opinions. One, authority means God he's the divine power on earth. He could do miracles. He's wielding God's authority sword. Number two of Fiorenza, where she points out that his subversive nature is undermining the authority of the time, and that is a form of authority by transitioning authority. And the last of Marcus Borg, he's showing authority by showing that the true nature of God's relationship to the human condition, and he's more of a wisdom teacher. So I thought this is so interesting, just to conclude with, that when we read authority, I think this is such a great, and I told you this could be authority or power. It's so divisive in the Christian community what power means. And I think especially in the 21st century, where we have, I think, negative attitudes towards power, the person who shows and wields his power, if anything is shown to be a weakness, is really paralleling very much at least some of the kind of reads that we'll see in the New Testament, that Jesus's power is something that parallels a lot of the doctrines that were being inculcated within the 21st century. And if anything, I think Jesus would be very happy to see, it didn't work out for a couple thousand years, his attitude towards authority. But I think in our modern day, this attitude towards power has been an evolving situation such that that it is open to these more inclusive definitions of authority that are already exemplified by Jesus in the first century.
Rabbi, yeah. So Christians do have very different definitions of authority. Now, I think I like NT Wright, right? So authority is given from above. He's God ordains. He can do what he wants to do. Then the second example, right? Yeah, Jesus was he did identify himself with the subversive groups, but that could mean political, political or or social or political authority or social authority, as in having a group of followers. I don't see how that's the real authority what Jesus talks about in this gospel, because having a group of followers identifying with the weak and marginalized, that can give you a following.
Wait, are you asking according to Borg or Fiorenza?
Fiorenza, right?
So,
Fiorenza.
okay. So,
Yeah,
she's a feminist theologian. So
yeah.
definitely coming from the feminist philosophical perspective. And I think that she looked into the sociocultural perspective that would have been paramount and widespread at that time. And she notes that everything Jesus does, it's almost like a subversive attitude towards authority. And specifically, again, in our story, he could have shown authority by just explaining to imagine he said to the scribe, "This is what you're thinking." Magic. It was amazing. But instead, he goes, "I'm going to prove my authority by helping the paralytic." So I think that's what she's trying to note. He shows authority by interacting with marginalized groups. By, as the example we had at the start, why is he washing the feet? Washing the feet is itself was an example of showing authority, which wouldn't make sense for any other religion. I think any religion hears this, it's just impossible to understand. So it's not based on hierarchical power. It's not based on how people see power in that time. He doesn't have to interact with the patriarch. He doesn't really have to interact with the court until the court calls him. For a Jewish tradition, in order to wield power, you have to be part and parcel of the system, of the Sanhedrin, of the people who wield power. Jesus doesn't try to push into any groups except for marginalized groups. And that is, I think, Fiorenza's attitude towards this.
On that note,
Okay.
will Rabbi have a great Shabbos. Have a
Okay.
great
Thanks so much.
Shabbos. Talk to you next week. Thank you.